Okay, we're going to make a start. So hello and welcome to the Bristol Poverty Institute's Interdisciplinary webinar on climate change and poverty. My name's Lauren Winch and I'm the manager of the Bristol Poverty Institute, and we have a fantastic and varied set of speakers joining us today. But before we get into those presentations, just wanted to provide you with a brief introduction to our event today. So please do mute microphones for the presentations if you haven't already, and make sure you've added your name rather than being listed as guest, so we can ensure that all attendees are legitimate, and also so we know who you are if you ask questions later on. You're welcome to keep your video on if you want. This is optional, but I know some of the presenters prefer to be talking to faces rather than a screen, so I'm sure they'd appreciate a few faces looking back at them. Please also be reminded that we are recording this webinar, and by attending you're consenting to it being recorded and for that recording to be shared. We're really keen, particularly in this case, to be able to share that with COP26 coming up next week, to make sure that the important dimensions of poverty intersecting with climate change are factored into those discussions. So we're really keen to take that forward and looking forward to your collaboration and cooperation with those discussions. So as I mentioned, my name's Lauren and I'll be chairing this seminar today. And my colleague Jo Gillett will be taking minutes for our post-event reports, which will be circulated to all registered participants. So if you don't want your name to be included in that document for any reason, just let us know and we'll make sure you're not listed. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Bristol Poverty Institute, or BPI for short, because I'm sure I'll drop into saying that instead, just wanted to provide you with a little background. So BPI was established in 2017 as one of the 7 specialist research institutes, and that was in recognition of the university's strengths in poverty research, and is headed up by its director, Professor David Gordon, who's also with us today. The BPI was set up with the ambition of driving forward the university's research on causes, effects, and measurements of poverty, and that's in order to better inform policy and practice. And one of the key areas identified in the original business case for the Institute was to enhance interdisciplinary approaches to poverty. We've therefore launched this seminar series, now a webinar series, thanks to COVID, with the aims of facilitating networking, exposing researchers to different perspectives and approaches, showcasing the range and value of research taking place on poverty relevant themes across the university, and setting collaborations in motion. So we're running seminars in this series on a wide range of topics, from conflict of debt and from digital inclusion to childhood obesity, all of which have strong and important poverty dimensions. And of course, climate change is no exception. Climate change is likely to disproportionately impact poorer communities, and some attempts to mitigate climate change and move towards a more environmentally sustainable future can actually unintentionally increase inequalities and widen the gap. So we're really glad to have fantastic speakers here to explore that, and a really good group of attendees as well from a wide range of different backgrounds. And like I said, we've got 4 fantastic speakers who are going to introduce 4 very different approaches and perspectives on how climate change can intersect with poverty. After that, we'll have an open discussion and we encourage all of you to participate. In terms of the presentations themselves, we're going to give everyone 5 minutes each, which I will be timing, just to make sure that we've got enough time for our discussion. And the aim of those presentations is to provide food for thought and fuel for discussion. And we'll then open up the discussion to the room and encourage everyone to participate and reflect on the ways in which your research can contribute to these intersecting themes. Just to let you know, we won't be taking questions after each individual presentation, but please do make a note of any questions to bring up in the open discussion after all the presentations. You can either do questions typed through the chat window, or if you raise your hand when we get to the discussion portion, I'll go through them in order, or give or take an order. Apologies if I don't get that quite right. I'll also do a roundtable introduction after the presentations before we move into the open discussion. We really hope this webinar will be the catalyst for future discussions and development of research questions and potential policy and real world impacts. And just finally, before moving on to the presentations, I just wanted to welcome Professor Mamageti Pakeng, who's joining us today from South Africa. She's the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, but has just started a 1-year appointment as the first ever Bristol Illustrious Visiting Professor. And we're really looking forward to working with her and learning from her. So welcome to you, Professor Pakeng. So on to our talks. We're opening with Professor Guy Howard, who has recently been appointed as the Director of the Cabot Institute for the Environment, alongside his existing role as the university's Global Research Chair for Environmental and Infrastructure Resilience, and he's also a valued member of our own Bristol Poverty Institute Advisory Board. Guy is a water scientist and engineer with a background in policy and research in low and middle income countries, having spent over 15 years at the UK Department for International Development, focusing primarily on issues around water, sanitation and hygiene. His research has a strong focus on developing tools and methods that have practical application and which meet the needs of policymakers and operational managers at all levels, based on stronger co-creation of research to ensure that it's impactful. So over to you, Guy.
Thank you, Lauren. So as Lauren said, I'm the director of the Cabot Institute. What I'm going to talk about today really is, I suppose, in two areas of where I particularly work. The first area is around water and sanitation services and how they are affected by climate and their importance to poor people. And the second thing that I will touch on is around resilience in healthcare facilities, which is another emerging area that I'm working at a lot more and which has strong climate and poverty intersections. So I've spent the majority of my career focusing my work on service provision and also climate change resilience, primarily in Africa and South Asia, including extended stays in various different countries in both continents. So taking water and sanitation services first, what's increasingly becoming apparent, particularly in low and middle income countries, is the absolute necessity of basic services of drinking water supply and sanitation to support adaptation and resilience of communities more widely. What's becoming clear is when people lack those services, impacts on climate change get magnified, and they get magnified primarily through the transmission of diseases, increasing ill health amongst populations. And then more broadly, we know that what happens is that when poor people have a major health crisis, that can be something that pushes them into further and deeper poverty, or it can push people who are not quite poor into extreme levels of poverty and penury. So at a basic level, these services are just critical. But we're still at a point in the world where over 3.5 billion people don't have access to safely managed sanitation. That includes 500 million people who continue to defecate in the open. We're also in a situation where over 500 million people don't have access to any kind of safely managed water supply. So at one level, the resiliences of poor people is fundamentally compromised because they just simply do not have access to the kinds of basic services that they need in order to be able to adapt to the changing climate around them and to manage the risks to their health. What's also becoming apparent is that there is insufficient attention has been placed by those people responsible for the planning, design and delivery of water and sanitation services on how you make those services themselves resilient. So not only are poor people often lacking the basic services that would help them adapt, but the services, when they do receive them, are themselves highly unresilient. So we are doing quite a lot of research at the moment, looking at how we develop metrics and how we support agencies like UNICEF, but also national governments make investments to improve the resilience of their water supplies and of sanitation systems. And very often these are quite basic measures, but fundamentally what they rely on is the engagement and voice of poor people in decisions that affect them. So one of the key constraints of resilience around those services is that very often the people who rely on those services the most, who may be asked to contribute huge amounts of time and effort into maintaining those services, are only rarely consulted on the importance and about important decisions about improving the management and improving the resilience. That has particularly adverse consequences for women and girls because they are, by and large, the people who are charged with collecting water. So if your water supply dries up in a drought, it's women and girls who then end up by having to spend 7 or 8 hours a day going to collect water. And that's not uncommon in countries like Ethiopia amongst very poor communities. It's also important because around sanitation, women are those people who are most likely to be at threat, are least likely to be able to access the services, and for instance, and where their particular needs, particularly around menstrual hygiene management, will be neglected. So there's very strong areas around water sanitation where the intersection of climate and poverty plays out. I will very, very briefly mention healthcare facilities because I know I'm almost at time. But this is the other area that we're increasingly looking at, is how do you make sure healthcare facilities are resilient to climate change and are more accessible and more effective to meet the needs of poor people. And just a couple of stats to just leave you with to show the scale of the problem. Something less than 60% of healthcare facilities worldwide have basic water, sanitation and waste management facilities. Those are all in low and middle income countries. That includes up to 10% of hospitals. And as a doctor once recently asked me, how on earth do they provide services if hospitals don't have water and sanitation? The answer is extremely badly, and they extremely quickly become locuses of disease, which particularly affect poor people. And cholera in particular is one of those things, but there's a whole range of infectious diseases where inadequate services in healthcare facilities put poor people's lives at risk. Anyway, let me stop there. So hopefully that will prompt some thoughts for discussion later. Apologies for the noise. I have building work going on, and rather alarmingly, I have large lumps of wood flying from about 3 stories up from my house to the ground at the moment, which is slightly concerning. But back to you, Lauren.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Guy. Yeah, it was really, really interesting and some really thought-provoking points, particularly about the importance of consulting with the people involved rather than just having the top-down approaches. So hopefully we'll be able to delve more into that in the open discussion. But in the meantime, let's move on to our second speaker, who is Dr. Alix Dietzel, who's a lecturer in politics in the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies, and who's also the co-lead for Cabot's environmental change theme. So Alix's research focuses on climate justice and climate policy, including comparing the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to non-state actors, which also seek to drive action on climate change. Alix is currently working on understanding just transitions at the city scale, focusing on Bristol itself, and also sits on the Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change. And she's also recently released some fantastic research on the importance of justice and intersectional engagement in the climate emergency, which I'm hoping we might hear a little more about today, either in the presentation or in the discussion. So over to you, Alix.
Thanks, Lauren. Cute cat. It's always nice to see a cat in a meeting.
Sorry.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alix, and I wanted to talk just on a few small thoughts today on climate change and poverty. So, as Lauren said, I'm a climate justice scholar, and for me, the relationship that's really important between poverty and climate change is that it's going to exacerbate poverty and make things worse, both within countries and between countries. So it increases injustice at the global and local scale. And that's what interests me as a climate justice scholar. As Guy briefly mentioned, it's really important when injustices are increasing like this that the victims of climate change are the people that are primarily affected, which overlap very strongly with groups that are already in poverty, get a say in what decisions are made around climate change. So in my past work, kind of my PhD and what I've been doing in the past few years, I focus a lot on global decision-making around climate change and distribution of responsibilities. And as Lauren mentioned, I was trying to compare the UNFCCC, so things like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, with non-state action, like the action of cities and corporations and individuals, and trying to kind of measure, in a sense, which side was more just. Which side was doing better. And what I found is overlapping problems of lack of ambition, lack of radical action, greenwashing, business as usual, and basically endangering the lives of those who live in poverty and are threatened by climate change. And this is becoming increasingly alarming, of course, in the run-up to COP26 in particular. So I think in terms of decision making, we can't make just decisions around climate change and what to do about it without considering the voice and lived experience of those who are going to be most affected. And this is why I've now turned my research more towards the idea of just transition and how to make good decisions around just transition. And as Lauren mentioned, I've been studying the city of Bristol for the past year. This was funded by the Cabot Institute, and I did my research with Dr. Alice Venn, who will be joining us in the law school as a lecturer from January, and lives in Bristol as well, did her PhD here. And what we found in our research is that there's really problematic aspects to decision-making around climate change in the city of Bristol, which has promised a just transition that is fair and inclusive for everyone in the city, which is great to see in a policy document, especially as a justice scholar who's used to ambiguous and vague promises at the global level. So Alice and I went in with muted but optimistic expectations about what we might find in this radical space of Bristol as the city. We studied 6 sub-state actors and went to meetings recording thoughts and observations on these meetings, and we also interviewed experts, 12 experts from these organizations, including the Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change, the One City Boards, Livable Neighborhoods, ARUP, and Black and Green Ambassadors, and Cycling Works. And what we found is that certain voices really dominate the discussion, and this is what recently made headlines in lots of different news outlets, including BBC News, which was quite cool. But basically what the media really was interested in is that the voices of white men really dominate the discussion. So although they make up 40% of participants, with white women making up 41%, they speak 64% of the time, or spoke 64% of the time in our observations, whereas white women were speaking around 30% of the time. But most shockingly, although there were about 16% of participants were people of color, they only spoke 3% of the time. And these findings were actually skewed because we attended a meeting by Black and Green, which was very representative of people of color. And if we hadn't been at that meeting, the statistics would look even more skewed. So how this relates to poverty, obviously there's no direct correlation between race and poverty, but it does tend to be that the most powerful and the richest in society get their voices heard the most. And in the case of Bristol, that would be white men, statistically speaking. So that's why that's problematic. However, we also found some other problems that were interesting, including a lack of space for meaningful critique of policy in meetings. So lack of time to reflect and talk about radical action. And just like at the global level, vague ambitions around just transition in the city with lots of lofty promises, but confusion about how to meet them, how to do it in an inclusive manner, how to get people's voices heard, and really like the steps we take to get there to those radical targets. And for both Alice and myself, this was not surprising to see because it overlaps so much with the global level, you know, certain voices dominating, lack of space for critique, vague ambition. But it was disappointing to find this in Bristol, which is meant to be quite a radical action on climate change. So I'll end there, and I'm happy to discuss any aspect I've just mentioned further in the discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. 1 second to spare, so absolutely spot on timing. Thank you very much, Alix. And that was really, really interesting. It was really great to see how your discussion led on from those points that Guy had raised, and really highlighted that need for engaging with different voices across the community, and particularly with people who might be more likely to be affected. So next up, we've got Dr. Ed Atkins, who is a lecturer in the School of Geographical Sciences. Ed's a political geographer interested in the contested character of environmental and energy policy, politics and governance, with a particular focus on the local politics of climate change policy and energy generation and consumption. 3 key areas of focus for Ed are the concept of a just transition, linking to what Alix was just talking about, the localized energy demands of digital technologies, and the contentious politics of hydropower. Like Alix, he's also a member of the Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change, as well as sitting on the steering committee for the Bristol Inclusive Economy Initiative and the UK Future Earth Early Career Network. So over to you now, Ed.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I'm going to speak about mitigation and kind of look at the other side of the coin. So rather than climate change exacerbating poverty and inequality, thinking about how what we do as a society, or what our governments do and our private enterprise does, how that can exacerbate inequality and create new geographies or new kind of schemes of winners and losers. I'm going to be focusing a lot on the kind of the global north, particularly on the UK, but this has global dimensions too, which would be quite good to unpack in the discussion. To kind of throw some statistics at you, it's expected that 1 in 5 jobs in the UK may be affected by decarbonisation and the transition to net zero. This is skewed by geography. So if you take the example of Yorkshire and Humber, where where research is recently done, it's expected that around 360,000 jobs are at risk there. That's 15% of the total workforce. Research by the Grantham Institute in the same region have shown that around 260,000 workers are at risk of seeing their skills becoming redundant in a new net zero economy. So they will either be forced to skill up or reskill, or they will be at risk of being left behind. Now, so it's no surprise that for many communities, transition and decarbonisation are kind of met with scepticism and fear, because for them it resonates as lost jobs, local economies disrupted, and communities broken. This is quite deep set in history when you see the decline of coal regions, for example. In Appalachia, the decline of the coal fields and the closure of mines coincided with increase in poverty and an opioid epidemic. Elsewhere, such as in South Wales and Durham, the new economies which came in, the new jobs which came in, either proved to be precarious and quite short term, or they disappeared entirely over time. So when it comes to previous transitions, there is a lot of scepticism and concern about a repetition of the past. This hasn't really been kind of addressed when you think about the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement in Paris, which is primarily based around how climate policy fails to take into account rural inequalities. So there is a need here for us to think in terms of the past, but also to address concern and scepticism and general fear for jobs in the communities who may be losing them the most. Decarbonisation can happen without job creation. There's a lot of promises about green jobs and good jobs and highly skilled jobs across politics and the media at the moment, particularly in the run-up to events next week. But research has shown that that's not necessarily the case. In Germany, low regional unemployment rates led to lowly paid jobs in the renewable energy sector. In the USA, non-unionised workers working on utility-scale solar projects earn substantially less than those who are unionised. And offshore wind projects in the UK have been found to use irregular migrant labour, paying substantially below the minimum wage and demanding extensive working hours. I was on a call with the RMT union last week, and some of the cases around this are quite shocking and would not be expected in what we see as a clean, green and progressive sector. Green jobs can be transformative. They can be targeted to address youth and underemployment. They have been used in the US, the key point of transition from people leaving previous employment, such as veterans from the military. And they can provide new lines of work for marginalised communities. Yet they're not quite there yet. As it stands, they are existing along current and historical patterns of inequality, and with it quite often poverty as well. Transitions are rarely smooth processes. And as a result, there are always winners and losers. Jobs are lost and new lines of work emerge. What's necessary here is concerted government action and a holistic vision of what decarbonisation and net zero actually looks like. We've seen historically central government provide funded programmes to ensure that communities have a route out of the poverty which might be caused by decarbonisation. In the USA, extensive compensation was paid to tobacco farmers as the US government regulated tobacco. In the UK, the false decline of the mining sector in the 1980s was accompanied by a series of programmes, not all that successful, which are based around creating new forms of community entrepreneurship, there's no surprise there, but also new forms of community economy. So what is key here is that mitigation of climate change is not a panacea for all problems. It needs to be accompanied with a wider understanding of how it may exacerbate social and economic problems such as inequality and poverty, and how that operates on geographical scales. Alix and I both work on a just transition, and this is something which again is contested. Trade unions are interested and they're very keen to kind of explore these policies, but they're concerned about that term transition. For them, a transition does not destroy jobs, it creates hundreds of thousands of new ones. It helps communities keep services in schools, it doesn't gut them and destroy them. And it expands public sectors and public transportation to ensure there is more efficient use of space and time and kind of travel. There's a global angle here as well, which is really important just to highlight it before I close, is that for many unions, this cannot come at the costs of others elsewhere. A just transition here means a just transition everywhere. And on that note, I'll end, and I hope my timing's been okay.
That was brilliant, Simon. Thank you, Ed, and also brilliant presentation. And it's really good to kind of think about those other dimensions and about how might be there's unintended consequences. And obviously, I'm sure we're all in agreement that we need to mitigate climate change, but we need to do it without causing further challenges for sectors of society. So that was really interesting, and hopefully have some good discussion points on that shortly. But before we do that, we do have one final fantastic speaker, who is Dr. Mary Chang, who is a Senior Research Associate in the School for Policy Studies, and she's a valued member of the Bristol Poverty Institute, having supported us and collaborated with us in various ways over the years. For example, she's the cluster lead for our multidimensional poverty measurement research cluster, and she's also conducted various events with us and helped out lots of things. So we're always really pleased to work with Mary. So Mary herself has conducted a range of poverty relevant projects, including research on topics including child poverty, gender dimensions of poverty, and COVID-19 in Africa. She's currently leading a research project on the mental health toll of food insecurity due to climate change and how this links to poverty and inequality in South Africa and Uganda. So I'll hand over to you, Mary, for our final presentation.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks so much for inviting me to today's seminar on climate change and poverty. I would like to contribute to this meaningful discussion by sharing some findings and thoughts generated from the work that colleagues and I have been doing on high temperatures, food security, and mental health, and the studies from the very active research community focusing on the same issues. Climate change influences everybody on the planet, but people in poverty are disproportionately affected. In 2019, the United Nations published a report warning that climate change can push more than 120 million more people into poverty by 2030, and will have the most severe impact in poor countries, regions, and the places where poor people live and work. One example of climate change is high temperature. Over decades, more and more all-time high temperatures have been reported across the globe. Extreme high temperatures increases the risk of drought, flood, sea level rise, and extreme weather events. They added to huge challenges and stress on preserving safe water resources and agriculture lands and maintaining a sustainable food system. The World Food Programme estimates that by 2050, the risk of hunger and malnutrition could increase by 20% due to the failure of preventing the deteriorating situations caused by climate change. Our study using data from South Africa and Uganda found that the perception of food security has an association with the level of happiness and life satisfaction, which indicates that high temperatures, or more broadly, climate change, does not just affect physical health, but can also play a role in mental health. This argument is consistent with other research showing that rising temperatures are associated with disturbed sleep and serotonin, a hormone critical for adjusting our feelings, emotions, and behaviors. Studies found that in England and Wales between 1993 and 2003, when above 18 Celsius, every 1 Celsius increase in temperature was associated with 3% increase in suicide. In Finland, between 1996 and 2013, every 1 Celsius increase in the temperature accounted for 1.7% increase in violent crime, and children who exposed to traumatic disasters, which may be caused by extreme weather events, reported a high level of depression. Adapting to and mitigating the negative climate impacts require people to build up, live in, and maintain a resilient, robust, and sustainable environment. Simple examples include an adequate living area with air circulation and green and blue spaces, the enhancement in farming methods that can support climate-resilient crops, or building flood-resilient infrastructures. Unfortunately, much effort is needed to make such changes. It is estimated that by 2050, about 200 million people will be displaced due to extreme environmental events, or whose migration is triggered by deteriorating environmental situations. Due to climate-related events, people who are driven away from home face increased risks of losing education, job and livelihood, and social and community network and support. In short, climate change is associated with poverty in water, shelter, education, health, income, and many other aspects, leading to both material and social deprivation. Climate change gravely affects the physical and mental health of people who are already in vulnerable conditions. Climate crisis in this sense is also humanitarian and societal. It requires us to take immediate actions and to work collectively on paradigm shift of the current leadership and social protection frameworks and strategies for an inclusive and sustainable future. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to our further discussion. Thank you. Back to Lauren.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mary. That was really, really thought-provoking, actually, in talking about all the different dimensions, from kind of the food security element to rising heat levels to how that links to serotonin, and really kind of complex, interwoven, various different interdisciplinary approaches, which we're hoping to see through these webinars. So seeing that you're kind of already doing it with your colleagues in various places is fantastic and really inspiring, and hope we can take those discussions forward and take that to the next level, because it's really important, valuable work. So now we're going to move on to our open presentation. So what we're going to do first is just do a quick kind of roundtable. Obviously we've had our speakers introduce themselves already, but I'm just going to go down the list of participants and ask everyone to just kind of say a quick hello, say who you are, and maybe a little bit about why you're interested in this space, and then we'll move on to kind of questions and discussion. So first person on the list who hasn't spoken so far is the BPI Administrator, that's Joe Gillett. So Joe, do you just want to say hello quickly?
Hi everyone. Yeah, I work with Lauren and Dave for BPI. Yeah, I'm interested in listening in and been trying to take notes just there. So yeah, probably just say that for now. Thanks, Lauren. Fantastic.
Thank you, Joe. And again, thank you for helping out with running this webinar. We couldn't do it without you, so it's really, really appreciated. So next person on the list, as Joe actually just mentioned, is David Gordon, who's the Director of the Bristol Poverty Institute. So I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, thanks to you all for coming to this seminar. I have a long-term interest in both climate change and poverty. Way back in the Jurassic era when I was younger, I did a PhD on climate and environmental change, and for the past many decades I've been working on poverty issues. So I'm very interested about the intersection between what the effects of climate change will be on those most vulnerable in society, and what can be done to mitigate those impacts and to have a just transition. I think that's going to be one of the key problems that need to be resolved over this coming century and possibly the following century.
Fantastic, thank you, Dave. Next on the list is Jane Metz. I can't hear anything, so she might be away from the computer for now. So we'll move on to the next person, who is Joanna Mack.
Hi, thanks a lot for letting me in on this seminar. I think it's a crucial area, this, in terms, I mean, my main interest has been in poverty research, but it seems to be crystal clear, and your speakers very clearly highlighted how important it is to connect this to ways to tackle climate change. I think it's been a very neglected area in the public discourse. I've recently taken over as co-editor of the Journal of Poverty and Social Justice, and it's one of the areas I'd like us to be focusing more on in coming issues coming up, because I think this is one critical area for the question of poverty that has been under-resourced and under-investigated. And it's fantastic to see all the work that Bristol have been doing in this. So thank you for inviting me.
No problem, thank you for coming. So next name is Jonathan Rigg.
Good morning, everyone. I'm in the School of Geographical Sciences at Bristol, and I've been working on smallholder livelihoods in Asia for a very long time, maybe as long as David. And I'm interested in the intersection between livelihoods, poverty, and agrarian change and climate change. So it's been a very interesting morning so far.
Fantastic, thank you, Jonathan. So next up, we've got Katie Cooper.
Hi everybody, I'm a programme manager in the RED department, and I am new in post looking at climate and biodiversity, so I've come to kind of listen to the intersection here with poverty.
Great, thank you, Katie. So next up we've got Lauren Blake.
Hi everyone, yeah, thank you, really interesting presentations this morning. So I'm Lauren Blake, I'm based in the School of Geographical Sciences, and I work on agri-food systems, kind of everywhere, but my particular focus in Latin America and the UK. And yeah, a huge component of that is looking at kind of injustice and poverty and inequality within the food system, and taking a systems perspective, looking at the key challenges at the moment. Obviously, climate change is one of the biggest ones within the food sector. So yeah, that's why I'm interested in joining today.
Great, thank you very much. Next up, we got Mamagati Pakeng.
Thanks, Lauren. I joined the seminar. Thank you for inviting me. I joined this webinar because climate change is one of our key areas. Sustainability is one of our key pillars in our vision. But of course, the conversations, the presentations were very interesting, the presentations that went past just now. And as people were talking, I kept wondering, of course, I'm in a region that's going to be one of those affected the most. And of course, the question is, what can the people in those regions do? Is there something, or do they wait only for the behavior to change on the other side? And in the meantime, of course, the destruction continues in the name of development that people desperately want, because people in poor areas see themselves as lagging behind. And anything that's been sold as development is what they want. And some of it actually is problematic in this context. So I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Next up, we've got Marilyn Howard.
Hello, thanks for letting me join the webinar today. I'm a postgraduate student at the School for Policy Studies and also an honorary research associate at the law school. And my interest in coming along today is because I'm doing a bit of pro bono work with the UK Women's Budget Group concerning climate change and social security. So I'm particularly interested in the intersection between gender and social security, particularly in the context of climate change and the different stages that we might be going through in the future.
Great, thank you very much, Marilyn. I've just seen that we've had a comment from Jane in the chat, who wasn't able to introduce herself earlier. So if everyone can just take a look at that when you've got a second. She's saying she's a paediatric registrar in infectious diseases and interested in how she can get more involved in these discussions. So I assume perhaps her microphone isn't working, but obviously, Jane, if you've got any questions you want to engage with in the discussion, then feel free to type them in chat and I'll keep an eye on those for you. So just a couple more people to introduce before we move to the open discussion. Next up is Paul Bates.
Hi there, I'm a professor in the School of Geographical Sciences, and my principal interest is in flood risk, which is not specifically poverty, but I'm interested insofar as flooding at large scales can create significant impacts on people and even whole nations.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. And actually, I mean, that's one of the reasons we run these webinars, is to bring together people who aren't necessarily working on poverty itself, but whose actual research is relevant to poverty, to try and make sure that we're having a full kind of holistic approach and bringing in the expertise that we've got across the university, which can help to contribute to mitigating impacts of things like climate change on the poorest communities. So really glad to have people like you here as well, even if it's not something that you would say is your essential area of research. So next up, we've got Sharon Collard.
Hi, I'm a professor of personal finance in the School of Geographical Sciences. I'm also the Research Director of the Personal Finance Research Centre. And I'm also a board member of the Bristol Poverty Institute. So our kind of key areas, which I think there is some overlap, are around the poverty premium, and that's the extra costs that people on low incomes pay for essential goods and services. And at the moment, energy costs and energy prices being a really big issue in the UK for people on lower incomes, because that is one of the biggest poverty premiums that exists. But also one of the other ones that exists is around access to insurance. I think there's real questions about people's access to things like flood insurance in the future in the UK and elsewhere. And linked to that, that's on the consumer side. On the financial services side, I'm interested in kind of what's happening with the ESG agenda, the environmental, social and kind of governance agenda, where that's going in financial services, and some of the ideas around that got mentioned at the beginning around kind of greenwashing and consumer understanding about how they can make decisions that are kind of ESG friendly. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Sharon. And finally, last introduction is from Vicky Jones. There she is.
Hi Lauren, thanks. Hi, I'm Vicky. I'm from the Cabot Institute, which is an environmental institute at the University of Bristol. So I was interested in joining to hear more about this discussion and see where the connections might be between the people that we're familiar with working with and how we might be able to make new connections in this area. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Vicky. Okay, so that's all of us. So I can see there's a couple of discussions in the chat about potential preparation already, which is fantastic. But to kick off the discussion, does anyone have any questions or comments for any of the presenters based on what they've shared this morning? If you want to either raise your hand using the reactions button, or if you just type your name in the chat window, and then I'll call on you, and then you can unmute and ask a question that way. So Jonathan Rigg, I see you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. This is, I suppose, a question for everyone, but I'm thinking of Alix and Guy in particular. I'm wondering whether the intersections between climate change and poverty is producing or creating new populations of poor. So in other words, are, if you like, new people being made poor in new ways, or is it simply that poverty among the existing poor is being deepened? So do we need to, well, I've just been reading the World Bank Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report, you know, the new one that came out earlier this year. And of course, what they do is they take different kind of views of poverty, and depending which view you take, you get different groups coming out of the kind of miasma. And I'm wondering whether any of the speakers could comment on whether we need to think about poverty differently if the intersection is going to be captured effectively. You know, are we finding the right people, so to speak?
Lauren, I don't mind going first, and I'm sure Alix will want to contribute. That's a really great question, Jonathan. So, you know, I think your core of the question is, you know, are the current poor getting poorer, and are the non-poor getting poorer? And I think the answer is yes to both in certain places. But I think that's also partly an issue that we know, certainly from low and middle income countries, that very many of the non-poor are very marginally non-poor, and it takes very little to push them into poverty. So I think of countries where I've lived, like Bangladesh, where you can not be poor, but you live on the side of a river, and because the river's channels move every year, within, you know, a matter of hours, you can go from being non-poor to absolute penury because you lose absolutely everything, and it happens repeatedly. I think the core question, though, is right. I think climate change creates new vulnerabilities, and it creates new challenges. So one thing I think, you know, we continue to need to think about, both in this country and overseas, for instance, is people who live in places that are highly vulnerable to flooding very rapidly can get priced out of insurance markets. So, you know, the house gets flooded once, You get one insurance payout, your premium goes up, and then increasingly you can't afford to re-enter an insurance market. And how do you deal with that? I think also people who previously haven't been poor will start to face new challenges as, water availability becomes less predictable, food becomes more expensive, quality becomes less certain. So I think we will have to have new ways of thinking about poverty. I suppose the final comment I'd have on this, so as part of my PhD, I did a very long chapter looking and examining issues around urban poverty. And there's always been a core question around poverty, which is, do you think about absolute poverty, which is the World Bank and the poverty lines, etc., or actually do you think about relative poverty? Because if you think of the world in that way, it doesn't matter how much money in absolute terms you have. Most of your experience about being poor is in relation to what you can access compared to other people that you view around you, and the impact that has on your life and on your livelihoods and your social networks. So I would argue very strongly always that relative poverty is more important, but increasingly with climate change, I think it makes it even more important because there will be big winners and losers around this. Anyway, that's enough from me. Sorry, I'll hand over to Alix, who I'm sure has much more cogent things to say than me about that.
Well, I was going to agree with you, Guy, and say it's both, exacerbating existing poverty issues and creating new ones. What I would add is that climate change has an interesting dimension on top of that, which is that those in poverty tend to have very low emissions, and those who are richest tend to have very, very high emissions due to their consumer behavior. So it's not only a question of preventing poverty or making sure to lift people out of poverty as we tackle climate change, like Ed was talking about, but also to remember that they haven't caused the issue, and there might be another dimension of responsibility towards them because of that, and more responsibility for those who have higher emissions and who are richer. So I think it adds complexity to how we view those who are in poverty and at risk in terms of who's responsible for doing what.
Great, thank you, Alix and Guy. That was really, really helpful responses. So we've got a few hands raised. I'm assuming that those are people's own questions rather than wanting to come in as a response to Jonathan's. But I think Ed is indicating he might have a response to Jonathan's questions, so I'll go to him first.
Sorry, just really quickly, because to make it even more complex, there's been a report released today by the Jubilee Debt Campaign, which has shown, I'm just reading off the screen, lower income countries spend 5 times more on debt than coping with the impact of climate change and reducing carbon emissions. So there's an important international question here about climate finance and debt relief. Climate finance is going to be one of the main topics at COP26. So it's a really significant kind of point of complexity when you think about multilateral climate governance and how that kind of filters down to the national and local levels as well. So there are these cross-scale international questions when it comes to who's entering poverty and whether they're previously poor and it's being exacerbated, or whether they are the new poor, like you say, Jonathan.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Jonathan, did you want to respond to any of those answers at all, or are you happy for us to move on?
No, interesting to hear those answers, thanks. I'm happy for the discussion to move on. There are lots of questions for the look at.
Brilliant, thank you. So the next point we've got is, I don't know if everyone's seen, but Mary's put a comment in the chat just to flag that herself and some of her colleagues are planning to submit an application on the mental health of children in poverty in the context of climate change and experience of climate risk. So if anyone's interested in that, do get in touch with Mary, or if you get in touch with the BPI team, we can pass that on for you. So next person with hand raised was Dave Gordon.
Thanks, Lauren. I wanted to ask Alix and a number of the other speakers about what can be done over being more inclusive in terms of getting more people involved, not just the usual suspects who are largely white middle-class men. So if you look at public attitudes to climate change, even before the publicity. 94-95% believe it's happening, and over 80% believe that something should be done. And yet when there are debates about it, it's always dominated by this minority group of middle-class white men in the UK. There are a number of reasons I think that why other groups in society are more suspicious. Of course, there's a long and inglorious history of environment and climate change activism, which has blamed it on there being too many people in general, and specifically on there being too many Black and Asian babies in the world. And there does need to be a move away from that, because that obviously causes suspicion. There's also cynicism, ideas like climate footprints, which everyone knows about. Were invented by British Petroleum, and it's not surprising though everyone knows about it. They spent $200-300 million on disseminating it. If you had that for your impact agenda, the SRC would be very pleased at the impact of your research would have. Also, there's cynicism. The Paris climate conference in COP21 had equity at its heart, whereas this 5-year review in COP26 seems to have dropped the idea of equity. And net zero doesn't necessarily have to be equitable. It can fall on the poor, as people sometimes fear. Just put up the price of gas and then that will get rid of the problem of climate change. It also leaves the problem of climate change on technology that doesn't exist or for future generations to solve. And the young are also cynical about, why isn't it more being done now rather than leaving it to them to sort out. So what strategies do you think needs to be done to get around this quite understandable cynicism and to get a broader section of the population on board? I mean, they already think things ought to be done, but they just aren't participating in the kinds of debates that we need everyone to be involved in.
Okay, since you directed the question at me first, I'll start, David. So I'm not an expert in this, and I'm working, on understanding it better myself. I think there's different aspects depending on like the city context or the global context. So at the global context, we know that access to COPs is meant to be universal for every country in the world. But we also know that people who actually make it to COP, there's vastly different power dynamics going on, because some people have lots of people able to go to the negotiations, representing their country. They've been well trained, they speak English really well, and they can go to multiple meetings, because COP isn't just one meeting at a time, it's overlapping meetings. So these kinds of structural barriers can impede people from having their voices heard in the first place, because they're not in the room. But also, even if they are in the room, they might be hesitant to speak, like we found in our research in Bristol. Or if they do speak, their comments and their thoughts and their pleas often don't make it into the final policy documents. So I always tell my students, the Paris Agreement was almost 90 pages long in the final weeks of the negotiations. There were lots of options on the table, including the option, for example, to literally make a list of countries that are most responsible for climate change action. And those kinds of options were slowly stripped away as countries went line by line through what was acceptable. And what ended up in the legally binding Paris Agreement sections was, what the richest and most powerful countries wanted, which was vague targets, vague ambitions, no discussion of particular responsibilities, just this nebulous, common but differentiated responsibility, and we'll just set our own targets and see in 5 years what to do next, which I've been heavily critical of since it happened. But now we're seeing the effect of that, which is that we're running into serious problems. There was a report just out yesterday by UNEP saying we need 7 times the ambition we have currently to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. And then in terms of Bristol, Alice and I are working on understanding this. We're going to have a panel event at the end of November with Black and Green ambassadors, the deputy mayor, Asher, with the city of Bristol, the co-lead of the Green Party, and some Black and Brown community groups. We're still arranging the panel, but we're going to have a kind of sit down and a discussion of exactly this question: how could we increase people's voices being heard and participation? and I'm talking for a long time, so I just want to say a couple things that came up in interviews are that people don't feel welcome in those spaces because there's harmful narratives around how Black and brown communities don't care or don't have the time, when in fact they're really engaged in environmental issues and have not always been recognized. So there's suspicion around that. And then also there's this issue of tokenism. So if you're the only Black and brown person in a meeting and somebody says, so how do we engage with your communities? That is incredibly condescending, misrepresenting the diversity within diversity, and just an uncomfortable space to be in. So those are just some thoughts I have on the global and the local level, but I'm still learning myself how to make things better.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that question before we move on?
Well, if I could, Lauren, and I mean, partly I said if he would have thought a government led by Boris wouldn't have put equity at its heart of any negotiations. You know, gosh. And you're right, Dave. I mean, the point about population is one of the things that has always really bugged me, because actually carbon emissions are much more associated with old white people than they are with very young Black and brown people. And so if you were going to have a population control method, I'm afraid you would logically veer more towards euthanasia for us, I'm afraid, than you would do for controlling birth rates elsewhere. So I did actually once suggest that in a different meeting, and it didn't go down terribly well, but that possibly explains why I never went further up in the civil service. I think, and Alix has talked about this, about participation. I mean, you know, there is a fundamental mismatch that we have in terms of countries' power. I mean, it's one of the reasons why things like the small island states groupings, the least developed countries groupings end up by being so important, because the only way you get real power behind their voice is through a collective voice. But as with all negotiations, negotiations are never equal. I mean, it always ends up by benefiting the most powerful within the room, and that will always be, you know, the G20 countries, and specifically the US and China, that will go around that. You know, we all try to make efforts around how you do that. I think one of the things that I see is if we can increasingly draw together, for instance, the climate security and global health security agendas, then you have a real way of pushing it. Because actually what COVID has really shown is if you want to have genuine global health security, you have to invest in poor countries. And there's just no two ways around it. You will never achieve it if you don't do that. And so I think there's some options there. I think the bigger challenge, probably in both high-income countries and low-middle-income countries, is how do you really engage and encourage people who have a lot of other things that go on in their life to really engage with a subject that can sometimes feel quite tangential. And I think we're still struggling and still trying to find ways around that and ways of engaging with people. I think it's about trying to lock it back into people's real lived experiences. And I think one of the problems with climate change has too often been is that we too often talk about what's going to happen at the end of the century, what's going to happen by 2050. Well, if you're poor and you have a daily wage, you don't really care about those timelines. You really care about what's going to happen tomorrow, maybe what happens next week, or a bit longer. So I think the research community and the policy community needs to do a lot more about how you make this more meaningful and real to people's daily lives. And that's the point, I think, in which you get engagement. But it's a great question, and there's a lot more to be done around it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Guy. That was really, really helpful. Just before we move on to the next question, I've just noticed we've been joined by Lee. So I don't know if you would like to introduce yourself, Bai.
Sorry, I was hoping to join from the beginning, but I got urgent childcare responsibility with the child jumping around me, so I don't want to keep my mic on, but I'm trying to hear what other people are saying. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. And we are recording this, so if you want to watch back the first part, you're very welcome to do that as well. Okay, so our next question was from Paul Bates. You've got your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lauren. So this is a question to all the panelists and everyone really. The other large macro scale change that's going to happen is happening and will continue to happen over the 21st century is urbanization. And I wanted to get the panel's insights into how urbanization, climate change and poverty interact, because that seems to me an important part of this particular puzzle as well.
I was looking to Ed or Alix. Go on, to go first.
I mean, anyone else as well is welcome to come in who wasn't on the panel if you've got any thoughts on that question. Obviously, it's yeah, it's a big challenge. It's a shame we don't have Sue Parnell here. I think she would probably be the best place to answer that.
Yeah, but it's a really important question, right? Because I think as urban centres grow, particularly in the really big cities, you already see in Asia, and you increasingly are starting to see in Africa. You are seeing environments that are not necessarily dissimilar to European environments 150 odd years ago, and you had the predominance of development of slums, informal communities, people not accessing services, and that often made worse, certainly in Asia and Africa, by very often legislatures that reflect a colonial period, have never been updated, that fundamentally work against the interests of poor people around tenure, etc. And I think, I mean, livable cities will have to be a focus because the risks of not doing that are so high in terms of the impact on health and on the impact on global health. There's very strong arguments, for instance, to say, well, sanitation is far more important in a big city than it is in a rural area. Because you get it wrong in a big city, you start to make a very large number of people sick, and across all different kind of categories and income groups. So I think it will be a major challenge, and there'll be a challenge about transport, about communication, about how do you manage building stock to cope with increasing temperatures, how do you to pedestrianize cities, but also how do you prevent investments to make cities greener actually marginalizing the poor further. So I know, for instance, in Scotland, there's been a lot of work about thinking about sort of clean air zones in the centre of Glasgow, and that's all very lovely and it's great, except all the dirty bushes then got pushed into the poorer areas in the east of the city, and all the investments into nice cycling paths and roadways went into wealthy areas. They didn't go into poorer areas. I think it's an ongoing challenge. I think it would be a priority, but I would make one plea, and this is not just because I grew up in rural Herefordshire, which is, as much as urbanisation is important and urban poverty is critical, we do still need to remember that rural poverty remains entrenched. And if you look at poverty, for instance, in the UK, rural poverty is some of the worst poverty that we will find, but remains largely invisible because you don't get large numbers of people congregating in one place. They're all spread around different communities. So in addressing urbanisation and climate change, we do still need to remember you can't leave the people who remain in rural areas behind, and you have to get to some kind of balance in your investments.
Yeah, thank you. Ed, I think you've got your hand raised. Did you want to come on that?
I think Mary got there first. Mary, do you want to go first?
Oh, thanks, Ed. And thank you, Paul, for this important question. And I think Guy's response is very inspiring. So I just want to add a quick point. And I'm sure everybody here knows something called the urban heat islands. So which means that on average, the urban areas are hotter than the rural areas. And there is estimates that in the future, about 2/3 of the population are going to live in urban areas. And that is in particular challenging for people who wouldn't have adequate like housing conditions in the urban areas. For example, they live in an overcrowded household, like 7 people need to share a single bedroom, for instance. And also people may not have sufficient access to the green spaces like a park, also blue spaces like a swimming pool. So I think it shows the challenge that urbanization is not only like a thing that benefits everybody equally. And when we plan for that, maybe we should already take into consideration the vulnerable groups, and to make sure that when people migrate into the urban areas, they still have the adequate access to the necessary conditions they deserve for a normal daily life. So that's the point I want to quickly add to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you. And over to you then, Ed.
Thank you. Yeah, just to echo Guy and Mary's points in the fact that cities are responsible for the vast proportion of energy use, but our energy is mainly generated in rural areas. So there is a kind of a connectivity issue there. So in places like Brazil, there's fast hydropower plants built in the north of the country, and the energy is sent down 2,000 kilometres to the urban centres. That's not a uniquely Brazilian thing. There are hydroelectric plants in Northumberland, which I can't remember the name of, but they are the energy is sent onto the national grid, and there are households literally within a square mile of it who aren't connected to that grid. So there are important problems of rural poverty at play here. But just to highlight that issue about air pollution as well, is that in London it's proven that poorer communities are more exposed to air pollution from vehicles, for example, and that needs to be taken into account in mitigation, because it leads to incredibly adverse health outcomes, and it should be something which is at the forefront of our minds when we are thinking about ultra low emission zones and so on and so forth. But yeah, just to echo those points.
Yeah, thanks for those responses. I think that's really helpful. It kind of helped me clarify my question. So if I was posing it again and being as eloquent as the responders, it's probably something along the lines of, does urbanization exacerbate the link between climate change and poverty, or does it mean populations find it easier to cope with the impacts of climate change? And my hunch is that it exacerbates it, but I'm clutching at straws, really.
So Dave, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, just to respond to Paul. Urbanization, because of the action of the housing market, often works by concentrating the poor in certain areas. So you can look at Charles Booth's map of poverties from the 1880 in London and the 21st century map. And although the housing stock has changed and all the jobs have changed and all the people have changed, the poor areas still remain poor because of the way the housing market works, and the way if poor people become richer, they move out to another area, and new low income people move in. So urbanization helps in some ways in that you know where the poor are because they're going to be in the same place, so you can tackle the problem of poverty. It also helps in terms of it's cheaper and easier to deliver the kind of services to people that they need, electricity, water, than it is in a dispersed rural population. So there are some advantages to urbanization as well as some disadvantages in terms of climate change, and it really does depend on the planning of the government and local authorities about how to deal with it. In some ways, it could be highly advantageous to have urbanization if you want to tackle the problem of climate change and also reduce poverty and raise the living standards more broadly across the population. It's not like it's a disaster from that point of view. It's how it's done, I think.
Thank you. And Alix, did you want to come in? I think you dedicated yourself just as we.
No, it's okay. I was just going to agree with Ed that cities are responsible for the majority of emissions at 70%, I think, around there. So the more people who move to cities, the more we have to deal with that fact and how to make cities lower emissions places, but that in itself can exacerbate poverty. And sometimes, these are things touched on by the other speakers. If you think about how cities are approaching, for example, building new houses to be more energy efficient and have solar panels and electric charge points and all these things, these are often really, really expensive homes that people can't afford to buy if they live in poverty or even if they're middle income. So creating all these nice new urban spaces is usually only accessible to the richer people of society, and that exacerbates inequalities and can make them worse, and can mean, as we move forward with moving away from fossil fuels, that becomes even more inaccessible to those living in poverty.
Brilliant, thank you. Did anyone else want to respond to this, or should we move on? So we haven't got any other kind of hands raised or questions at the moment, although I do notice there's been a bit of discussion in the chat about debt and how that intersects with these issues. Obviously, that's something that Sharon's team in the Personal Finance Research Centre would potentially be able to engage with. We've certainly had discussions about debt and poverty and run seminars on that. So if Guy and Ed, who are talking about that, are interested in that, I can put you in touch with the people who came to our debt and poverty seminar, who've got some expertise in that area. So very happy to link you up, because at the end of the day, these webinars are great and interesting, but we want them to help to build connections and move things forward, because there's so many valuable things being shared today that we want to capitalise that and see where we can take it forward. So we've got a couple of hands being raised. I don't know if that's that's waving for somebody leaving. Okay, I wasn't sure if there's suddenly a sea of hands, and I wasn't sure if everyone all of a sudden had a question, but I see that Paul has to leave, so thank you, Paul. So I think, Jonathan, you had your hand raised there, and then Guy also afterwards.
Yeah, it was just a quick one in response to the kind of rural-urban discussion, which I think it's important not to see these as two separate worlds with different sets of issues and different degrees of poverty, that poverty in both are co-produced. And actually, I think the really interesting question is, what is happening, the processes that are occurring in rural areas, which may displace people from rural areas because they can no longer make a living because their crops are being undermined, their yields by climate change, how that then results in urban poverty, and vice versa. So I think, myself, I think it's unfortunate when things get, we kind of, half the world is interested in urban poverty and so on, and half the world is interested in rural poverty. And increasingly we need to think and theorize across those two spaces.
Thank you. Do we have any response to that, or just to pass over to Bailey? Apologies, I see you had your hand up, but hadn't looked at the participants window. I've just been looking at the video, so apologies if you've been waiting a couple of minutes, Vibe. Did you have a question for the group?
No, that's fine. I want to apologize for being late. I was so looking forward to the talks, and I now don't know what I've missed. So apologize for being late again. So the reason I'm so interested in today's party, and I'm late for this party, was that I'm principal investigator of a MRC-funded research project looking at system intervention tackling malnutrition in all its form in 12 Asian countries, including China and member states of Southeast Asia. And I was lucky enough to have Guide to support us well from the beginning. I'm sorry I haven't got a chance to catch up with you, but I will send an email later today, Guide. So Guide is one of our international scientific advisory board member. And at this stage of our project, I'm really keen to expand the International Scientific Advisory Board and to invite more members from our Bristol community who have expertise in the interaction between climate change and malnutrition in all its form. As we know, we call these two syndemics, which means they share common causes and they develop at the same time. So our project using system methods to develop what I call double duty population level intervention across 12 countries, and we already established health minister level of collaboration with governments in those countries. So really keen to invite anyone from this room. I know there's a lot of experts here who are interested in this project, and please drop me an email. I will be really happy to work with you and learn from you as well. So I'm a lecturer and principal scientist from the Center for Exercise, Nutrition and Health Science within the School for Policy Study. So we're keen to hear more from you. I know I've missed your excellent talk today, sorry. Also, one of my students at the moment, I'm about to submit an interesting systematic review, synthesize global evidence between the link between malnutrition and climate change. And we found really interesting finding, and that showing there are a lot of evidence showing the link between malnutrition in all this farm and climate change. So again, I welcome any of you who want to support us as a co-author, then please send me an email as well. We're going to type my email in the chat box. Thank you for your time.
Brilliant, thank you, Bai. And if you've got any of that information you want to send to myself and Joe, we can include that in the post-event summary, if that would be helpful, including your contact details, just so we can share with everyone, and obviously all the people who have already left today, and there are a couple who had to drop out at last minute due to unforeseen circumstances. So we're very happy to share your details with the wider group of people who expressed an interest in being here today. So feel free to send that through to myself or Joe at the Bristol Poverty Institute, and we'll get that sorted for you. Did anyone have any comments or responses to Bai's comments there? So we've got Guy Howard, you've got your hand raised, and this will probably be our last question before we move on to kind of wrapping up. So over to you, Guy.
Thanks, Lauren. So it's a bit less of a question, but just before I do that, if I can just say I agreed with Jonathan's point exactly about looking at poverty across rural and urban areas and not seeing them as separate issues. And just to say to Bai, really interesting about that systematic review. I'd be very interested because it's been a problem. People trying to make the links between climate and malnutrition has been problematic. So
Thank you.
See that.
Thank you. So I will probably write an email, invite you to be a co-author then. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll do. I mean, well, I have that one. Let's wait and see if you want me to co-author. The comment I wanted to make, I think it was Mamagati said right at the beginning, listening to our talks about, well, what are we saying, for instance, particularly to poorer countries, lower middle income countries, about what you can do and recognizing aspirations. And I do think one of the things that we have to accept around just transitions is that many countries in Africa and Asia have not been major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And there is a fundamental inequality about preventing them from emitting some greenhouse gases if that helps their economic and social development. I won't go into it now, but there's a guy called Kevin Anderson, who used to be the lead of the Tyndall Centre, did point this out, very clearly about the historical legacy of North European countries around climate change. More importantly, though, I think one of the issues that we have to think about when we're looking at international development and poverty reduction and climate change is actually supporting countries to identify solutions that work properly and well in their context. And I think exactly what we shouldn't do is by saying that we have all the answers when we sit in Europe and North America and then go out and just sort of hand those solutions back over to other countries and expect them to implement them. I think there is a real need for a much more creative way at looking at solutions to problems that are rooted in the local context, in local cultures, and in local expressions of what they want to achieve in social and economic development. And I don't think the world does enough of that. We get fixated by technology transfer rather than co-creation, co-development of new technologies that are better fitting for the context within which they're deployed. So I just wanted to say we didn't answer that question, I think, earlier on, and I just wanted to acknowledge it, and I think it's a really important question and something that we should continue to talk about.
Yeah, I was going to respond as well to the question of what can we do, in these lower income countries. And I think the value of sharing lived experience cannot be understated, and making policymakers hear that, either at places like COP negotiations in the blue zone or in the green zone, or more informally in protest movements or transnational justice movements where people are working together. We've seen the power of sharing lived experience between school children, for example, on climate justice and their fears, and how powerful that's been. We've seen Indigenous communities coming together across the world to share lived experience, and how powerful that has been. So I think storytelling and really making people listen to what you are experiencing day to day and what your fears are, make that problem much more contextual and real, and in some ways go towards avoiding what Guy was pointing out, people in the West deciding what's best universally, which just isn't possible. There, I'm a universal moral scholar, and even I don't think there's much to universal morality beyond basic rights. So I think lived experience is really key, and paying attention to our histories, especially the history of colonialism, and how that's influenced global relationships as well, and why these Western powers are so powerful, and making noise about that. That would be my suggestion.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And does anyone else want to comment on that before we start to wrap up?
I think it's been a really fantastic webinar. Thanks, and the speakers have been brilliant. Thank you so much. And I totally agree with what Alix and Guy have said, but there is just a thought in my head that it's when middle class people in Crouch End start to get flooded regularly that actually something might happen, that the British government might take notice, and that is perhaps, those two things aren't mutually exclusive, but I can't help thinking that climate change actually impacting some of the middle classes in urban areas of Britain and London in particular might facilitate some change. I don't know if others think that's too cynical.
I would say it's got form, but New York legislature really woke up after Superstorm Sandy, and that's when a lot of the New York kind of climate plans came from. It coincided with the rise of a particular US president who is no longer president, but it's natural hazards, these big dramatic events that whole communities go through, are suddenly not just a symbol of climate change, but a symbol of what can come next, and that does galvanise a lot of attention. But again, with Superstorm Sandy, it affected a vast amount of people. But it was, the pictures of flooded subways in Manhattan, which really seized the news cycle. So it does tie into what you're saying, Sharon.
I agree, Sharon. When effluent started flying through the living rooms of the affluent, when the Thames flooded, the government then funded the Environment Agency and started to take flood defences much more seriously a few years back.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really, really important point, and yeah, I think I share your cynicism that that's probably in some ways what it's going to take. So just I thought might be good as a kind of closing thought is just to ask if our speakers have one sentence or one thought that they hope that those engaging with COP26 next week will bear in mind, just to ensure that these poverty dimensions are part of the conversation. So if any of our panelists have got a thought to share with COP26, and yeah, then we can wrap up.
Sure. So my one thought would be to ensure meaningful participation of climate change victims, and to not make such ambiguous promises around what you're going to do for them, but actually listen to what they need and take it seriously.
I would say some along the lines of don't forget the workers who you expect to kind of power decarbonisation. They're often kind of neglected as a voice on this stage, so bear that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's I mean, agreeing with both of Alix and Ed's comments, but would also be to say, we have to understand that climate change impacts play out through multiple ways. And so having a simplistic view that we'll just do one thing and that will help on climate change won't work. We have to be willing and able to engage across society and economies in order to make a difference.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to add that we have many discussions about the problems and what happened in the past, and we need to welcome more discussions and debates about how to build up a more robust and resilient future together.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mary. That was a really nice kind of succinct statement to close on, I think. So thank you again to all four of our speakers. Thank you to everyone who's joined today, to the fantastic questions and really engaged discussions. And as I said earlier on, I think we all hope that this webinar isn't a standalone interesting discussion, but that it's the start of kind of working together and working across some of these issues and exploring things from slightly different approaches than we might have done previously. So thank you again for being so engaged and for really taking part in it. And please do over the next week or so during these kind of COP26 discussions and all the buzz on social media around it and everything, please do put forward these messages about ensuring that that no one's left behind, really, that we do have an inclusive approach to future environmental sustainability and making sure that all sectors of society are considered when making plans for how we're going to mitigate that. So as I did mention previously, we'll be circulating a brief summary of this event to all attendees, as well as those who weren't able to make it on the day. And we're really keen to hear about anything relevant that you'd like us to include in that summary. So I've mentioned a couple of times where you've said about opportunities to engage with future funding bids or to engage with research projects. If there's any information of that nature that you'd like us to include in that post-event summary, do send it through to myself or Joe in the next few days, and we'll include that in the summary. And we're also planning on uploading the webinar, the recording of the webinar, to our website and to our YouTube channel, so you can revisit the talks or share with colleagues who weren't here today who you think might be interested, or if you had to miss part of it for whatever reason, you can watch it back and see what our fantastic speakers had to say. So my colleague Joe is going to put a slide on screen shortly, if he hasn't already. Sorry, I'm in another window. He's going to put that up shortly, which just got our contact details. So if there's anything you'd like to share with us, any ways that we can help you take forward what you've been discussing today and support that, we'd be really happy to do that. And yeah, just again to encourage you all to raise your voices about poverty dimensions of COVID-19 during COP26 and beyond, just to help to ensure that efforts to save the environment, save our planet, don't have unintended or disproportionate consequences for those in poverty, which is a message I think we all share. So thank you again for being here today and for your involvement, and hopefully we can take this forward and help to really drive forward a change in this space.